I could start from two different perspectives. So one perspective is if I understood you correctly, is the one you proposed, which is to start from a certain niche theory or even niche ontology, perhaps connected to some other issues in biological sciences or in embodied cognition, as it should be the case in when it comes to my work, and then navigate sort of stepwise toward the point at which we need to introduce some issues from institutional theory, what some economists did, and so on and so forth. And there's also, let's say, the other way around, so to speak, which is to start from institutional theory, especially institutional economics, and how people think about institutions in various social sciences. And then, once again, stepwise, move toward the point at which you realize that there are some gaps, there are some things missing, and perhaps we should get more interested in what these people in niche theory, for example, are doing. And so I started from the former, but right now, given my work in with some other people in the social sciences and in economics in particular, and in social ontology to some extent too, right now I switched suddenly, perhaps, and surprisingly for me as well. And the latter road is actually right now the way I'm trying to take. So what I would do is to start from institutions and then move towards niche theory and why we and I do believe that why we need niche theory to improve our understanding of institutions. So right now, this is what I'm trying to do in a couple of projects, let's say, of papers. So if you allow me to take this road,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then perhaps
absolutely.
we can meet at some point, let's say.
Yeah, let's see.
So yeah, so just to make it not too long, let's say, uh, but still with some content. Usually, I start from what an institution as such is, and of course, the literature is huge. But generally speaking, you have these general views in social ontology, especially, and also to some extent in economics, which is like institutions are norms or rules of the game in society, as Douglas North, the famous economist, called it, which means either formal norms or formal rules, written law, or some customs, informal rules or informal norms. And I don't want to discuss right now what is the relationship between rules and norms, because it's a different topic. But still, I think that the intuition is pretty clear. So this is one understanding. Norms, like the rule following view, as I call it, referring to philosophical semantics, you know what I mean, of course. And the other conception is that, and mostly it's, you might say, top down. So there are these rules and they are imposed on what we are doing every day. And so these norms constrain in one way or another our everyday behaviors. And even when when we refer to these informal rules, still this like top-down thinking is there, which is kind of problematic. But perhaps I will discuss this later. Uh, so this is one thing. And the other conception is inspired by game theory, and some theoreticians in this camp actually use game theory to provide more formal model, more formal, let's say, at least conceptualization of what they mean. And here the basic idea is that institutions are rather bottom up, spontaneously generated patterns or schemes of behavior. And they can be represented as Nash equilibria in specific social games. And so this is the second conception, that it goes in the opposite direction, so to speak. So either institutions are these top-down rules, all institutions are these spontaneously generated behavioral patterns, let's say. So this is what you have in the literature. And of course, there are hybrid views, let's say. So, for example, like the guy named Frank Hendricks from Groningen in the Netherlands, he came up recently with this hybrid view. I believe that Elinor Ostrom, a very famous economist from Bloomington, she already back in the 90s came up with some kind of hybrid view. De facto, let's say, she was not very theoretically diligent about this fact, but it was a de facto hybrid view of this kind. So, so this is the picture, let's say, a very coarse grain, let's say. And now, what are the problems? At least from my perspective, someone from the perspective of someone coming from niche theory plus embodied cognition, because this is my connection. So I got interested at some point when it comes to this rule following view, top down, let's say, not that much with what you might call institutional uh, success when an institution is successfully implemented, but rather with institutional failures. So, what happens when a particular institution fails at a given place in a given country, in a given society, or whatever? And now the usual answer that you can hear from all these rule following people is just, well, these norms are just not, they did not sink in properly. So people did not take these norms to their hearts. And basically, that's the end of the story. So, and based on that, you can have all these paternalistic education stuff that you need to educate people from these poor countries so that they can implement our of course, I'm right now not very serious, but to some extent I am, so that they can implement our best universal institution. This idea of universality is somewhat in the air as well, and that's it. And now, from once again, from the point where I'm standing, this is like okay, fine. To some extent, perhaps it's true, but the real question here is whether whether or not these top-down formal institutions are enforced, for example, by the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund and this kind of organizations, let's say, whether or not they answer specific needs, local problems. So there are certain problems that people in the country A, let's say somewhere in the world, are facing right now, or more systematically, they face a particular problem. And the question is whether or not this top down rule following institution answers these local needs. So right now, I'm sure you can see, you can sense, let's say, the direction I'm taking here. Because if there is this local aspect, a particular environment, social, ecological, even geographical, topographical, in many different layers, let's say, local environment, and some local issues with this or that, then we are, in a sense, already in a good starting position to start thinking in terms of niches. I'm simplifying right now, of course. So from this perspective, what is missing in the literature is this idea of what in one of my co-authored recent papers right now under review, uh, we call institutional environment, not institutional niche, but actually you can also talk about institutional niche. So, but taken seriously. And what I mean by that is that in the literature, in the economic literature, in particular, management literature as well, you have many references to what they call institutional environment or business environment, different kinds of environments, regulatory environment. But what they mean by that is best articulated by this regulatory environment idea. Namely, what they actually mean is set of rules, and that's it. So the term
Sorry, I
environment,
didn't hear that. What they
what they mean
actually mean
is certain rules.
certain
So,
rules.
so
Okay. Yeah.
regulations, like the governmental business regulations, this kind of stuff. So they use the term environment, but they don't take it so seriously. And actually, it, well, you can replace this term with any other term, or you could just drop this term, and there is no difference for the theory. So our idea, my idea, and the idea of my co-author in this paper about institutional environment is to take this notion seriously, to actually investigate how institutions influence the way we perceive at the most fundamental level, even we perceive our, well, the entities, the affordances, to express it in the Gibsonian way, what kind of affordances people perceive, what kind of affordances or opportunities for action, let's say, people can receive, so to speak, what kind of offers in the Gibsonian sense people can receive from the physical surroundings if they live under the rule of a specific institution, or that this institution or that institution. So the idea here is that if the notion of institutional environment is to make any sense, then we need to be able to to flesh out how institutions shape our uh, perception of, well, of our surroundings, which actually goes down to what kind of actions we take as doable in a particular surrounding. Of course, I'm simplifying, but and here you must take into consideration what is really specific about niches, namely that these affordances, which means these environments actually, are relative to the agents acting in a particular physical surrounding. So there is no just agent and physical and the agent physical surroundings, but there is, of course, physical reality around us, of course. But somewhere in between, so to speak, there is what we really and non-trivially can call environment, or the environment of a particular agent, which is relative to the needs and capacities and institutional frameworks of this particular agent. So, in this sense, this use of the term environment, at least in our argumentation, at least begins, starts to be, if I can put it this way, non-trivial. Okay, and if we have this relatedness, then the idea of a niche naturally comes up. And so here we are at the point at which some, let's say, inputs from niche theory, empirical niche theory in biology, but also niche ontology, can actually be useful. And so this is like end of part one, in a sense. And in this platform, so to speak, I'm trying to do various things, and of course, I can tell you more about it if you like. But I'm trying to, let's say, do some more to address some more specific topics, because the picture I have just presented is very general. So I'm trying to address some more specific issues, and one of these issues is about problems, how actually problems come up, what it means to perceive something as a problem, as a challenge, or whatever. So something like calling for our specific action. And usually when once again, when you have this whole problem solving talk in economics and in social and also cognitive sciences, problems are just assumed. Well, there are problems, a lot of problems, just look around. But philosophically speaking, it's highly non-trivial. Where do these problems actually come from? And why I have different problems sitting right now here in front of this tree, different when compared to the problems faced by, let's say, a bird living in this tree. So problems also are niche specific. So in actually two of my papers right now, both are under review. I'm trying to address this particular issue, the nature of a problem, let's say. So, and and there are some more specific, let's say, issues that can be addressed. on this more general platform I have just portrayed. So this is one thing. And the other thing is like when you start from this, not from the rule following view, this top down, but you start from the other one, from the other theory of institutions, which is this equilibrium approach, as they call it, according to which institutions are these spontaneously generated patterns, behavioral patterns, which can be represented as states of equilibrium in a particular game. So the idea is just nice, but and here I will be brief, I promise. So, but the problem we end up with a similar problem. So what these people miss is the fact that if you are about to act, if you are about to come up with any strategy, and the notion of strategy is like fundamental for the very conceptualization we are talking about here. If you are to come up with a strategy, you already need to have at at the get-go, at the beginning, and at least to some extent established cognitive niche or environment in which you can act, in which you can perceive something as the goal of your action, and so on and so forth, in which some actions are just doable. So, and this refers to physical infrastructure, of course. So, the usual example in this literature is that car traffic, whether or not you have some formal rules, sooner or later there will be a behavioral pattern in which people going in one direction stick to one side of the road and people going in the opposite direction stick to the other side of the road. So you don't need any formal rules. Perhaps, I mean, sure, there will be accidents, but sooner or later, people will come up with this pattern, let's say. And I mean, fine, but you need physical infrastructure. This is like obvious, but you also need to assume that people know where they're going. I mean, it may sound trivial, but it's by no means trivial. So they need to have goals. They need to perceive these goals as accessible cognitively and physically even accessible. So there is a whole list of things, let's say. So they need an environment, a particular environment. So they need a particular, let's say, um, realm of affordances, once again, in order to be able to come up with some action strategy. And this is, once again, this is missing in this literature. This idea that that you cannot just assume that there are these available environments or environments consisting of available things, perceivable, thinkable, achievable, and so on and so forth. So the question once again here is, okay, so what is the nature of this specific environment in which these institutions as equilibria, let's say, can emerge? And one more thing, what they also miss and this is especially interesting from the perspective of the ontology of location and boundaries and this kind of stuff, is that sometimes, or even in principle, but not always it's so visible, these behavioral patterns themselves create certain space, if you like. This is quite fascinating. And the example, and this will be the last thing I promise, the example I usually come up with in such an occasion when I'm about to present this idea is a soccer game, but not a soccer game in a huge like stadium, which means physical infrastructure designed for soccer games, but like kids playing in the park. So they occupy a certain like part of the lawn and they play soccer. And the two backpacks or the two trees can serve as goals. You can even deal with just one goal. The idea when this is a circle around it. I mean, you can play it in 100 different ways. And what is special about it is that the game they are playing at that moment establishes a specific location, or you might even say a specific niche. And I'm sure that all other people in the park want to avoid this specific place. So this is one thing, because they don't want to be hit by the ball. in this place, there are specific rules and behavioral patterns, and there are specific roles, like the two backpacks playing the role of the goal, and so on and so forth. So, what is the idea here is that this behavioral pattern not only requires a specific location, but it constitutes a specific location. And this is once again something missing in the literature. And this latter thing I find especially interesting, although I have not done any like, you know, formal ontological work yet. Um, yeah, so this whole slogan, situated institutions, is, I believe, I'm not very much fixated on the term, by the way, but you need to give a name to something when you apply for funds, especially. So, what this slogan stands for is this idea of taking the role of institutions in the creation of our cognitive environments seriously, and the other way around, taking the role of our cognitive environments in the creation of our institutions seriously. So something more like situated or embedded, let's say. And yeah, so this is like the general idea behind this whole thing. I'm not sure to what extent it's
Good. So
satisfactory, but
I mentioned Roger Barker in one of our email interactions, I think.
yeah,
Did you look at
yeah, yeah.
Roger Barker?
Yes, I did when I was reading my book, the one
Yes.
you were kind to quote. And so, and I also have this based on your, I have some notes based on your chat, GDP chat, in which this is mentioned, and there are some interesting things to address here, especially this difference between individual, more individualistic, let's say, and more collective approach to this whole thing. I well, I believe there is no real dichotomy there. Uh, but yeah, this is something to be addressed.
So did you look at
And
his book called One Boy's Day?
no, no, not this book.
Okay,
I
so
find
this is
some
an
papers
amazing,
referring to his.
it's an amazing contribution to empirical science, which would be nowadays impossible because of the
Hmm,
ethics rules, particularly when it comes to children. So what he did was, I think he had a team of people, and they followed one boy from the time he woke up in his bedroom to the time he fell asleep in his bedroom. And they catalogued all the, well, they call them settings. That's Roger
yeah, yeah,
Barker's word for niche or environment, including
yeah,
football and all of the things you were talking about, creating an environment by using your bags to create the goalpost and so forth. He treats everything that happens through the day. And then what he concludes, and this is, of course, his starting point, is that at every point in his day, he is in some environment. So the bedroom is an
yeah,
environment, the kitchen table is an environment, and so on. The schoolroom is an environment. The school is an environment which includes the schoolroom as a sub-environment. And then included in the schoolroom as a sub-environment is the little group of boys chattering away in a corner. Um, so it's a very hierarchical view of behavior settings. And now,
yeah,
I what I would like to do is work out the role of situated institutions from that sort of perspective. And I think there are so many problems. So Barker does tend to treat the setting as a niche in the sense of being a certain region of space which is a
mhm,
part of a larger region of space, which is also a niche. And the problem is that that approach fails already when you have a road system, for instance, because the road system
mhm,
extends across the whole continent. It's not just one space. It's not a space at all, really. It's a in the sense that a
yeah,
space is a topologically um, uniform part of the whole of space generally with its own boundary. The road system is not like that. It's more like spaghetti. And then the other issue, of course, is the fact that nowadays many of our interactions take place online, which takes the road system problem exponentially worse from our point of view, because we lose all physical connection with space when we're dealing with online phenomena. So anyway, they are my initial reactions.
Yeah, if I can add two things. I mean, when it comes to Barker and his idea, so one thing is, and this is actually what, uh, how should I say it? What prevented me, so to speak, from engaging more into his thinking when I was writing this book, is one problem is that when you have, well, my understanding of this behavioral setting is that it's like momentary, but it has no product, so to speak. And here's what I mean. What I find interesting is that some, it's like it well, actually it goes back to this famous distinction made by Kazimierz Twardowski between acts and products. And so you can generalize it, make and having processes and products of these processes and so on. So what is fascinating is that some behavioral settings in, if I understand it correctly, in his sense of the term, which are dynamic and so on, uh, are productive in the sense like they produce some relatively stable structures. And in the book, I try to, and this is just one possible conceptualization of me, but at least I try to conceptualize this whole thing in terms of boundaries, interactional boundaries, which are at least remotely stable over time, and so on and so forth. And so the surfaces of our our everyday things are, in my view, I'm quite constructivist here, are such interactional boundaries of physical entities. So some actions are productive and some other actions are not productive. And the same applies, in my view, to behavioral settings. So you have this school, you have a gathering of kids in one place or in a different place in the school. And these are all settings, but how should I say it? But the school itself, I know it sounds absurd, but the school itself as an institution or organization or even the building, let's say, but the building is the least important thing here. It was produced by some other behavioral settings in the past, and there is a certain history and evolution of this whole thing, of this productivity of ontological or metaphysical productivity of certain behavioral settings. And so this seems to be missing from my perspective. I might be wrong. I
You
need
mean
to
it's
read the
missing
book. As
from
I said,
Barker?
yes, this
Yeah,
is my
I agree.
understanding
I
that
agree.
this, yeah. And this should be, I believe, introduced somehow to this view if this view is to be useful, for example, in accounting for social institutional, more complex structures, let's
Yes.
say. So this is one thing. Another thing is I forgot. Oh yeah. So I know it's a. So you said that the road system is not just a place, but it's more like dispersed, let's say, or I don't know, like this
It's like the
kind
air
of
we
net.
breathe. It's everywhere.
Yeah. In a sense, yes. So uh, what came to my mind is something I tried completely independently of my professional research. But as someone who, and believe me, it goes somewhere. Uh, as someone who also publishes in a newspaper from time to time, just let's say my commentaries in a national newspaper in Poland. Once I tried to conceptualize and to use some elements of my, let's say, professional vocabulary to conceptualize what is so specific, and I don't want to go into politics too much, but what is so specific about this very special status of the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. but because people say different things, that this was a liberal empire or whatever, and right now it's collapsing according to some. I don't know. But what is special to me is that in addition to state boundaries or state borders, you can also think of an entity which I provisionally called institutional boundaries. And these institutional boundaries may be quite different from the state boundaries. So if you have a weak state, it's formally on the map, but all its institutions are somehow designed by some other actors, let's say. So it's not a real state, it's just something on the map. But on the other extreme, you can have a state like the United States back in the 90s and early 2000s, especially, exporting, as it were, its institutional solutions, free market capitalism, and so forth and so forth, and quite beneficiary. I'm not against it in principle. Uh, so the institutional boundaries of the US are, let's say, well, for the lack of a better term, in a different place compared to the actual state boundaries that you can see on the map. So when you think of these institutional boundaries, these are not even lines on the map. They are somehow dispersed, functional here and there, and so you can have this complete spatial, how would you put it, discontinuity, because, well, let's say you have the institutional boundaries of the American Empire, if you like the term, in Western Europe, then plus Poland and the Baltic states, but then you have Russia. Well, not that much. But then you have Japan and Korea on the other side of the continent, also applying these institutional boundaries, so to speak, of of the American system, let's say. So it's very specific, and yeah. So this is what came to my mind when you were talking about the need to supplement this vocabulary of spaces and niches as spaces with something more, let's say, relevant to our times, especially.
Good.
And this
And
whole thing may be
can you now perform the same trick with the digital world?
yeah, in a sense. Uh, well, it seemed to be the case that the digital world had no boundaries at all. And right now we know it's just not true. You can block certain things and you have no TikTok in various countries, or no American content providers in China. So there are boundaries. And now the question is well, where are they, traditionally speaking? Where are they? Because they are somewhere, they are very real, but on the other hand, they have no intuitive location. Uh, so it's perhaps even more difficult than the imperial, so to speak, institutional boundary, the digital boundary. Yeah, but I don't have any clear answer to that because I don't want to be too naive that, we have this system without any boundaries, which is just not true. But I don't have any, at this point, I don't have any like acute concept to grasp this phenomenon.
So nearly everything that we've done in the ontology world over the last 25 years or so becomes problematic as soon as you try to use it with regard to digital entities.
Yes, this is my intuition. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have, for instance, quite a healthy collection of manufacturing ontologies, which cover things like maintenance and supply chain and so forth. But it doesn't work for manufacturing software.
Yeah.
There are no transport problems. There are no maintenance problems which are counterparts of what we have in the real physical world. So let's talk about the issue of what we do next. So I really enjoyed
just
what
one
you
thing came to my mind.
yeah.
Uh, just it's just a thought. I
Yeah.
remember this quite famous, very famous Marxist geographer David Harvey, if I'm not wrong, he once said that capitalism annihilates space. It makes space irrelevant
Hmm.
in time. So the real like force for capitalism is time, and time annihilates space because you can trade, from Shanghai to New York,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's actually irrelevant. So right now, digital technologies and 5G, or 6G, or 100G, what have you, they even annihilate time because time is irrelevant. There is no
yeah.
delay whatsoever. I
So
mean,
what
at
was
least
the
this is
name of this
what we
man you
are
mentioned?
promised. David, if I'm not wrong, David Harvey. David, yeah, David Harvey. He's a geographer and let's say a public intellectual in the Marxist tradition. I'm hardly a
Okay.
Marxist, but I find this observation quite interesting. I
Yeah,
must
yeah,
say, very interesting.
yeah.
He's a clever guy. But anyway, this is just a thought.
Yeah, so let's think about what we might do next. Um,
Yeah,
so let me just say, I was really impressed by what you just did. You covered things that have just never appeared on my radar, even though I've been thinking about what you call situated institutions quite hard for some years. Since I wanted to make Roger Barker and also J.J. Gibson, who was the other
yeah,
side of this movement of ecological psychology, I wanted to make their work ontologically relevant in a strong sense. And I'm still working on that, and you're helping me. But what do we do
you
next?
you made my day, I can say.
Good, good. What would be your suggestion?
So, well, when I was reading your conversation with ChatGPT, and
Yeah,
I made some notes, let's say. So one idea, a very simple idea, for a paper, let's say, because you always need to frame the paper in such a way as to make it publishable,
yeah.
understandable, and so on. And you need to address it to specific readership. Um, so let's say a certain road might be that you have this, as provided by ChatGPT, this like development of thought in which Barker and Gibson, they discovered these behavioral settings and affordances and all
Yeah,
that stuff. And then your contribution is by making this ontological step, so to speak, and reflecting on what kind of beings or entities these specific settings or collections of affordances, niches, what they are. And this also applies to your work with Aquila. Um, and now, um, what can be done is so once again, starting from the empirical level, then you climb up to the ontological level. I'm simplifying, of course. And now you have this work already done at the ontological level and some extra things that we might do in this paper. And now we can go back to the empirical level, not that much the empirical itself, but in a way, and to do justice, so to speak, to the specificities, the ontological specificities, so from this top-down ontological perspective, to certain empirically identifiable, observable cases. Like, for example, uh, the case of a specific institution in a specific country. This is very specific. Or more generally, let's say, the case of institutional niches as such, what kind of entity it is. This
and
kind of
problems
business.
also.
Yes, and problems is like my fixation point right now, so you don't have to convince me about
So
that.
what would be your proposed strategy? Do you want to take the ChatGPT text and turn it into an expression of what you think is important, and then I will take over and build on that?
Yeah, this is a
Okay,
good idea. This
that
is a
would
good
be
idea
my
because
ideal also.
yeah, because we can, since we've been provided, let's say, with this
Yeah,
content, by artificial intelligence, we can actually use it and build something on that and go in
Yeah.
various directions. So yeah,
And,
this sounds
and
good.
let me just add one desideratum from my point of view. So
Okay.
there are these five E's. So embodied condition, cognition, and I've forgotten the other E's. But I think that we
I
need
well five. Oh my God.
ecological. I
I
can't
stopped at
remember.
four. I
Anyway,
stopped at four,
there
but
is a
perhaps
literature
like
on five E's now, I believe. I
yeah,
want
yeah.
our position to be uh, set apart from those. It's not about cognition. It's about I don't want to say interaction. That's too weak. It's about the total of the the agent or the group of agents and the environment in which they operate, but not viewing them as separate, rather viewing what the agents do as being what they do only because the environment is there. I don't know
Hmm.
if that makes sense, but so this is the opposite of Andy Clark at the one hand, which sees cognition as an expanded mind.
Hmm.
And then it's the opposition at the other end to reductionists who say that there are only physical things. So what we're saying is that the interplay between organism and space creates cognition, but cognition is not to be understood in just one way, namely as a product of the mind of the organism. It has to be understood as belonging to this whole made up of the organism and the environment. I don't know. I don't have a word for it, but maybe you have.
Yes, and well, what I can say is that I am not on this side. Well, to the extent to which I consider myself part of this 4 or 5 E movement,
Yeah,
to some extent, perhaps I am definitely not on the side of Andy Clark,
yeah,
but
I know.
I am on the side of Francisco Varela. And
Yeah, I'm
given
not
what
a
you have
fan of
just
Varela,
said,
I'm afraid.
yeah, I know, I can feel that, let's say, but what you have just said is very Varelian.
Oh, I know.
And of
And
course,
let me just add one more thing to do justice to what you were saying about institutions. I think that that intermixing of organism environment becomes even more complicated when institutions are brought into the mix. And
oh
this
yeah,
is
that's for sure.
actually something I dealt with. I don't know, did I send you this paper on territoriality?
I believe I have it, but just in case
Okay.
I don't,
So
please send me.
just the last couple of pages address the way in which real estate, which in the olden days used to be very spatially oriented in the tight sense. You would build your cabin in the woods, and then that would be your
Yeah,
home. And real estate now involves dozens of institutions, banks, lawyers, planners, developers. And I have a list of at least 20 institutions which were involved in buying a piece of real estate in the United States. And that means that the simple relation between the human being and his cabin is replaced by a relation between the human being and a plot of land, which was determined by a developer to have these and these characteristics, which were checked by these and these inspectors, who had to consult with these and these controllers of gas pipelines and so on and so on. So the world has become like the roadmap. It's
well,
not a roadmap in one direction, it's a roadmap in 17 directions, which are institutions which cross-cut each other and determine the
that's
meaning of
for
their
sure.
actions.
That's for sure.
Super.
But I would say that this is a development of a certain, let's say, structure or pattern established already back like 200 years ago, or even prior to that.
I think the
Because
Romans probably started it.
yeah,
To build
definitely.
those
And even
viaducts, you needed a lot
where
of
the
planners
American,
and
the,
inspectors.
the yeah. But what you mentioned this you mentioned this specifically American context. This is interesting because the difference between, let's say, uh, the behavioral setting of the indigenous people back in the 19th century living somewhere in
Yeah,
in the western part of the country and the newly coming people is that they, I mean, the settlers, they were already like bringing with them a certain and executing actually a certain institutional framework decided somewhere like in Washington D.C. or somewhere else, but definitely not in these lands. So this was not just a
Something
case of
similar
like
happened.
possessing.
Something similar happened in South America.
Yeah,
With
yeah,
quite
and
different
all these
consequences.
political things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is very politically like a hot topic. How are we to think and conceptualize this process actually? But actually, I don't want to go into politics. But right now you have like an extremely complex institutional structure behind or underlying, so to speak, just one part of real estate. So you're right. Yeah.
Yeah.